To the old lady who's finally going to step aside and let the real family breathe, my daughter-in-law said, raising her glass as if she were offering a blessing instead of a quiet execution. And for a moment, no one moved, not even me. I just sat there at the end of the long dining table decorated with blue and gold balloons for my grandson Ethan's 10th birthday, the kind of decorations I had helped pay for, the kind I had stayed up the night before tying into neat little clusters so everything would look perfect when he walked in. And I remember noticing how steady her hand was as she held that glass, how practiced her smile looked, like she had rehearsed this moment in front of a mirror. And then came the soft laughter, not loud, not shocked, just polite enough to make it worse, because it meant they understood, and they agreed. And I turned my head slightly toward my son Daniel, waiting for something, anything, a frown, a correction, a simple "that's enough, Ashley." But he just lowered his eyes to his plate, cutting into a piece of grilled chicken as if it required his full attention. And that was when I realized the toast wasn't a surprise to him, only to me. I felt my fingers tighten around the linen napkin in my lap, the fabric soft and expensive, another detail I had chosen, another thing I had contributed without being asked, without needing credit. Because that's what you do when it's your family. You give, quietly, consistently, without keeping score. And I had been doing that for over 40 years, through scraped knees and college tuition, through mortgage payments when Daniel lost his first job, through babysitting nights when Ethan was a baby and Ashley said she needed time to recharge. I had always been there, steady, reliable, invisible in the way only a mother can be. And yet here I was, reduced to a punchline wrapped in a toast. I could feel the eyes around the table flicker toward me, and then away just as quickly, like no one wanted to be caught witnessing what was happening. Ethan was busy with his new watch, tapping at the screen, blissfully unaware, and I was grateful for that at least, some innocence left untouched. I let a small smile form on my lips, not because I found anything funny, but because I understood something in that moment that I hadn't allowed myself to see before. This wasn't a slip. It wasn't a joke that went too far. It was a message, carefully delivered, publicly displayed, and quietly supported. I lifted my own glass, just slightly, enough to acknowledge the gesture without honoring it, and I took a small sip of iced tea, letting the cold settle the heat rising in my chest, because reacting would have given her what she wanted, and I had no intention of giving her anything more than I already had. Not today, not anymore. As the conversation picked back up around me, forced and shallow, I sat there, listening, watching, noticing the way Ashley leaned back in her chair like she had just claimed something, the way Daniel still wouldn't meet my eyes, and I realized that for the first time in my life, I wasn't sitting at that table as a mother, or a grandmother, or even a guest. I was sitting there as a problem they believed was already solved, and I smiled again, softer this time, because they were about to learn just how wrong they were. The rest of the lunch carried on as if nothing unusual had happened, plates clinking softly against silverware, the hum of casual conversation filling the room. But I noticed the way the air had shifted, subtle but unmistakable, like a draft you only feel once you have already been standing in the cold too long. I folded my napkin neatly beside my plate, even though I had barely eaten, and watched as Ashley leaned across the table to refill someone's drink, her voice light, her laughter easy, as if she had not just drawn a line in front of everyone and placed me firmly on the other side of it. Daniel finally spoke, but not to me. He asked Ethan about his new watch, his tone warm, engaged, the same tone he used as a boy when he would run into the kitchen to tell me about his day, and I felt something tighten in my chest at the familiarity of it, because that warmth had not disappeared. It had simply been redirected. I reached for my glass again, more out of habit than thirst, and caught a glimpse of my reflection in the window behind the table, the afternoon light casting a faint outline of my face, softer now, older, but still composed, still present. I had always taken pride in that, in showing up, in being steady, in making sure that no matter what happened, there was always a place where my family could gather, a place that felt like home. And sitting there, I realized that somewhere along the way, that place had stopped including me. The conversation shifted to summer plans. Ashley mentioned a trip to California, something about a beach house and reservations already made, dates discussed with ease, decisions finalized without hesitation, and I listened quietly, waiting for the natural pause where someone might turn to me and say, "Would you like to come?" But it never came. Instead, Ashley glanced in my direction briefly, just long enough to acknowledge my presence without inviting my participation. And then she continued speaking as if I were part of the furniture, something familiar but no longer necessary. I rested my hands in my lap, fingers interlaced, steady, controlled, and I let the silence around me settle, not as something empty, but as something revealing, because it was in these quiet moments that the truth became impossible to ignore. This was not new. It had been building for years, small things at first, invitations that arrived late or not at all, decisions made without consultation, conversations that stopped when I entered the room. I had explained them away, told myself it was generational differences, busy schedules, misunderstandings, anything but what it really was. And now, sitting there, I could see the pattern clearly, like pieces of a puzzle finally fitting together. I thought about the house, the one Daniel had grown up in, the one I had kept after my husband passed, every inch of it carrying memories I had preserved carefully, not just for myself, but for him, for Ethan, a place where they could always return. And I remembered how Ashley had once stood in the kitchen, running her fingers along the countertop, commenting on how much potential the space had, how it could be updated, modernized, improved. At the time, I had smiled, taken it as interest, as appreciation, but now I heard it differently, not as admiration, but as assessment, as if she had been evaluating something she intended to claim. I exhaled slowly, the realization settling deeper with each passing second. This lunch was not just a celebration. It was a statement, a quiet declaration of where I stood in their lives, and more importantly, where they believed I no longer belonged. Ethan suddenly looked up from his watch and smiled at me, a genuine, unfiltered smile that softened something inside me. "Grandma, did you see what it can do?" he asked, holding out his wrist, and I leaned forward, returning his smile, because whatever else had changed, whatever lines had been drawn, that connection was still real, still untouched. And for a moment, that was enough. But only for a moment, because as I leaned back into my chair, I caught Ashley watching us, her expression unreadable, calculating in a way that made the air feel colder again, and I understood then. Finally makes sense in a way it never has before. I pulled into my driveway and sat there for a moment after turning off the engine, the ticking sound of the cooling car filling the silence, and I looked at the house in front of me, the one Daniel used to call home, the one I had kept exactly as it was for so many years, not out of stubbornness, but out of love, because I believed that keeping things the same meant keeping something alive, something that mattered. I stepped out of the car and walked up the front path slowly, noticing details I had stopped seeing a long time ago, the slight crack in the walkway near the third step, the rose bushes along the side that needed trimming, the porch light that flickered just before it settled into a steady glow, all of it familiar, all of it mine. And for the first time in a long while, I allowed myself to ask a question I had avoided. Who, exactly, had I been preserving all of this for? I unlocked the door and stepped inside the house, greeting me with that quiet stillness that had once felt comforting but now felt different, heavier, like it was waiting for me to notice something I had overlooked. I set my keys down in the small ceramic bowl by the entryway, the same bowl Daniel had made in a high school art class, slightly uneven, painted in a shade of blue that had never quite matched anything else in the house. And I remembered how proud he had been when he handed it to me, how he had said, "So you never lose your keys again, Mom." And I had laughed and promised him I would use it every day. And I had, every single day, without fail, because that was what I did. I held on to things, I honored them, I made them last. I walked into the kitchen and paused, my eyes moving over the countertops, the cabinets, the small details that told the story of a life built over decades. And I thought about what Ashley had said earlier, not just the words themselves, but the certainty behind them, the confidence that I would step aside, that I would fade quietly into the background, that I would make it easy for them. And I realized that certainty had not come from nowhere. It had been built, reinforced over time by my own actions, by every moment I chose to stay silent, every time I chose to accommodate, every time I told myself that keeping the peace was more important than being seen. I moved toward the dining table and ran my fingers lightly along its surface, remembering the countless meals, conversations, celebrations that had taken place there. And I understood something then that felt both simple and overwhelming. This house, this life, it was not something waiting to be passed on. It was something that still belonged to me, fully, completely, in a way I had forgotten. I pulled out a chair and sat down, my posture straight, my hands resting calmly in front of me, and I let the silence settle again. But this time it did not feel empty. It felt deliberate, like a space I was choosing instead of one being imposed on me. I thought about Daniel, about the boy he had been, the young man he had become, and the person of intention. I was not reacting anymore. I was preparing, and as I sat there in the quiet of my own home, I allowed a small, knowing smile to return, because they believed the story had already been written. They believed the ending was already decided. But they had forgotten something important. This was still my life, my house, my choices, and I had only just begun to remember what that meant. The next morning began earlier than usual, not because I had anywhere to be, but because sleep no longer held the same comfort it once did. I found myself awake before sunrise, lying still in the quiet of my bedroom, listening to the faint hum of the house settling around me. And for a few moments I simply stared at the ceiling, letting the thoughts from the day before resurface, not in a rush, not in chaos, but in a slow, deliberate sequence that felt almost organized, as if my mind had spent the night putting everything into place. I sat up carefully and swung my feet to the floor, the hardwood cool beneath my soles, grounding me in a way I had not felt in a long time. And I moved through my morning routine with a calm precision, making coffee, opening the curtains, letting the early light spill into the kitchen, each action steady, intentional, as though I were reclaiming something I had been moving through on autopilot for years. I carried my coffee to the small desk near the window, the one I had not used in months, and sat down, placing the cup to my right, exactly where it had always gone. And for a moment, I simply looked at the drawer in front of me, knowing what was inside, knowing I had avoided opening it for far too long. I reached forward and pulled it open slowly, the soft creak of the wood louder than it should have been in the quiet room. Inside were neatly organized folders, documents I had gathered over the years, insurance papers, property records, and, most importantly, the legal documents my husband had insisted we prepare long before he passed. I had trusted him completely, trusted that everything was handled, that everything was clear, and after he was gone, I had not questioned it, not out of fear, but out of habit, because questioning things had never been my role. I picked up the folder labeled in his handwriting, the letters slightly slanted, familiar in a way that made my chest tighten just for a second, and I opened it carefully, scanning the pages with a focus I had not brought to these papers before. The language was formal, detailed, but not beyond my understanding, and as I read, line by line, something began to take shape, something that Ashley clearly did not know, something Daniel had either forgotten or chosen not to remember. I set the first document down and reached for the next, my movement steady, my breathing even, because this was no longer about assumptions or interpretations. This was about facts, about what was written, what was signed, what was legally mine, the house, the accounts, the decisions. They had not simply transferred in the way Ashley seemed so certain they had. There were conditions, protections, structures put in place that ensured I remained in control, not temporarily, not symbolically, but fully, completely. And I leaned back slightly in my chair, letting that realization settle, not with triumph, but with clarity, because the power I was beginning to see had been there all along. It had just been buried beneath years of my own willingness to step aside. I closed the folder gently and rested my hands on top of it, my fingers still, my posture straight, and I allowed myself a moment to reflect, not on what I had lost, but on what I had misunderstood. I had believed that keeping peace meant keeping connection, that silence meant strength, that patience would eventually be recognized. But now I saw that silence had been interpreted as absence, patience as permission, and my willingness to give had been mistaken for a lack of boundaries. I stood up slowly and carried the folder back to the table, placing it down with care, not hiding it, not tucking it away, but leaving it where I could see it. A quiet reminder of what I now understood. I walked to the window and looked out at the street, the neighborhood just beginning to stir, a car passing by, a neighbor retrieving a newspaper, ordinary life continuing as it always did, and I felt a sense of steadiness return, not the kind that comes from routine, but the kind that comes from knowing where you stand. I thought about Ashley again, about the certainty in her voice, the confidence in her posture, and I realized that her mistake had not been in what she said, but in what she assumed. She believed I would not look, would not question, would not act, and for years, she had been right. But that certainty no longer belonged to her. I turned away from the window and walked back toward the table, my steps unhurried, my mind clear, because now there was something to be done, not impulsively, not emotionally, but deliberately, thoughtfully, the way things should have been handled from the beginning. I picked up my phone once more, this time without hesitation, and scrolled to a number I had not called in quite some time. The name familiar, trusted, someone who had helped us put these documents together all those years ago. My finger hovered over the screen for just a second before I pressed call. And as I brought the phone to my ear, I felt that same quiet, controlled smile return, not because I needed anyone to see it, but because I understood something they did not. The story they thought had ended had only just begun to change direction, and this time, I was the one deciding where it would go. The voice on the other end of the line had not changed, steady, measured, and familiar in a way that immediately grounded me. "Margaret, it has been a while," he said, and I could hear the quiet recognition in his tone, the kind that comes from years of professional distance softened by long association. "It has," I replied, my voice calm, composed, as if this were just another routine call, and not the first step into something I had avoided for far too long. We exchanged a few polite words. Before I explained, briefly, that I had been reviewing the documents my husband and I had put in place, and that I wanted to confirm a few details, there was a short pause on the line, not hesitation, but attention, the kind that signals a shift from casual conversation to something more precise, more important. "Of course," he said. "Do you have the original copies with you?" I glanced at the folder. Resting on the table, exactly where I had left it, untouched but no longer ignored. "Yes, I do," I answered, and I could feel the quiet steadiness in my own voice, the absence of doubt that had once been there. We went through the documents one by one, his voice guiding me through the language, clarifying the structures that had seemed distant before but now felt clear, deliberate. And as he spoke, the picture became sharper. The house was not simply mine in name. It was protected in a way that ensured no one could force a sale, no one could claim ownership without my consent. The financial accounts were structured with layers that required my direct authorization, and the discretionary provisions, the ones I had barely noticed before, gave me a level of control I had not fully understood. I listened carefully, asking questions when needed, not out of confusion, but out of intention. Because this was no longer about trusting that everything was handled, it was about knowing exactly how it was handled. When the call ended, I thanked him, sincerely, not just for his time, but for the clarity he had provided, and I set the phone down slowly, my hand resting on the table for a moment longer than necessary. As if acknowledging the shift that had just taken place, the room was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet now, not uncertain, not waiting, but settled, defined. I looked at the folder in front of me, then at the rest of the house, and I felt something settle into place inside me, something that had been missing for a long time, not confidence in the loud, obvious sense, but something quieter, more enduring, a recognition of where I stood, of what was mine, of what I had allowed to be overlooked. I stood up and moved through the house slowly, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness, noticing the details again, the framed photographs along the hallway, the small imperfections that had once felt like memories and now felt like markers, evidence of a life that had been lived fully, not something waiting to be handed over. I paused in the living room, my eyes resting on a photo of Daniel as a young boy, his arm wrapped around my waist, both of us smiling at something outside the frame. And I felt a quiet ache, not sharp, not overwhelming, but present, because the boy in that photograph had not disappeared, but the man he had become had chosen distance in ways I could no longer ignore. I did not dwell on it. I simply acknowledged it. The way you acknowledge a change in the weather, something you cannot control, but must understand. I moved to the window and looked out again. The same street, the same passing cars, the same ordinary rhythm of life continuing. and I realized that nothing outside had changed. Only my understanding of it had. And that was enough, because understanding changes how you move, how you respond, how you decide. I returned to the table and picked up the folder once more, this time not as something to review, but as something to use, something to act upon. I opened it briefly, confirming what I already knew, then closed it again with quiet certainty, placing it back down in the center of the table. Not hidden, not protected, but visible, intentional. I thought about the lunch, about Ashley's words, about the way she had delivered them with such confidence, and I allowed myself a small, controlled smile, because confidence without knowledge is fragile. It depends on assumptions, and assumptions can be dismantled, not with confrontation, not with raised voices, but with simple, undeniable truth. I walked back toward the kitchen and poured myself another cup of coffee, the motion steady, familiar, and I took a slow sip, letting the warmth settle, not because I needed comfort, but because I appreciated the moment, the clarity of it, the stillness before movement. And as I set the cup down, I knew that what came next would not be rushed, it would not be emotional, it would be deliberate, measured, the way things should have been all along. They believed I would step aside, that I would make room for them without question, without resistance, but they had never asked themselves a very simple question, one I was now ready to answer. What happens when the person you expected to disappear decides to stay exactly where she is? 2 days passed before I saw them again, not because I avoided them, but because I chose not to reach out, and that alone felt different. There had always been an unspoken expectation that I would be the one to call, to check in, to maintain the thread that held everything together. But this time, I let the silence remain, not as a test, but as a decision, and it did not take long for that silence to be noticed. My phone rang late in the afternoon, Daniel's name appearing on the screen, and for a moment I simply looked at it, not with hesitation, but with awareness, because I understood that this call was not accidental. I answered on the third ring, my voice steady. "Hello, Daniel." There was a brief pause on the other end, just long enough to suggest that he had expected a different tone, something warmer, perhaps more eager. "Hey, Mom," he said, his voice carrying a casualness that felt slightly forced. "I was just calling to check in, see how you were doing." I leaned back in my chair, my fingers resting lightly on the armrest. "I am doing well," I replied, and I let the simplicity of that answer settle between us, because there was nothing else I needed to offer, not reassurance, not explanation, just the truth. He cleared his throat softly. That is good, he said. And then, almost as an afterthought, Ashley mentioned that things felt a little tense at lunch the other day. I allowed a small pause before responding, not to create discomfort, but to acknowledge the weight of what he had just said. "Did she?" I answered, my tone neutral, neither confrontational nor dismissive, just present. There was another pause, longer this time, as if he were deciding how much he wanted to say, or how much he was willing to hear. "You know how she is," he continued. "She jokes sometimes, and it can come across the wrong way." I let those words settle, turning them over quietly in my mind, not because I was confused by them, but because I recognized them. This was not new. This was the same pattern I had seen for years, the gentle reframing, the soft dismissal, the quiet request to accept something that should not have been acceptable. I shifted slightly in my seat, my posture still relaxed, my voice unchanged. "Daniel," I said, his name deliberate, steady. There was nothing unclear about what she said. The silence that followed was immediate, heavier now, no longer casual, no longer easy to move past, and I could almost picture him on the other end, his expression tightening, his shoulders shifting, the familiar discomfort of being asked to acknowledge something he would rather smooth over. "She did not mean it like that," he said finally, but the confidence in his voice had softened, and I noticed that. I noticed everything now. "Then how did she mean it?" I asked, not sharply, not accusingly, but plainly, the kind of question that does not allow for easy answers. There was no response right away, just the faint sound of his breathing. And for a moment, neither of us spoke, because there are silences that reveal more than words ever could. I did not rush to fill it. I let it remain, because I had spent years filling spaces for him, for them, making things easier, softer, smoother, and I was no longer interested in doing that. Eventually, he exhaled quietly, "I think you are reading too much into it," he said, and I could hear the shift, the retreat into something familiar, something safe for him. And I felt that same quiet clarity settle deeper within me. Not disappointment this time, but understanding. This was who he was choosing to be, and that choice had nothing to do with me anymore. "No," I said gently. "I think I have been reading too little into it for a very long time." There was no anger in my voice, no raised tone, just a calm certainty that did not need to be defended. And I could feel the conversation shifting again, but not in the way it used to, not toward resolution or reassurance, but toward something more honest, more defined. "Mom," he started, but stopped, the word hanging there, incomplete, as if he no longer knew how to finish the sentence, and I did not help him. I did not guide him. I simply waited, because whatever came next needed to come. From him, not from me. The silence stretched for another moment before he spoke again, his voice quieter now, less certain. "What do you want me to say?" he asked, and I considered that question carefully, not because I needed an answer, but because I wanted to give him one that was true. "Nothing," I replied, my voice steady. "I do not need you to say anything, Daniel." I paused briefly, then continued. "I need you to understand." And as those words settled between us, I realized that for the first time, I was not asking for acknowledgement. I was stating a boundary, clear, simple, and entirely my own. And whether he chose to meet it or not was no longer something I would carry for him. The call ended without resolution, without apology, without anything that resembled the kind of closure I once would have waited for. And yet I did not feel unsettled by it. I set the phone down gently on the table and remained seated for a moment, my hands resting lightly in front of me, my posture unchanged, because something had shifted in a way that did not require confirmation from anyone else. I had said what needed to be said, and more importantly, I had stopped saying what did not. The house was quiet again, but this time it did not feel like something I needed to fill. It felt like something I could move within. I stood up slowly and walked toward the hallway, my steps measured, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness, each movement deliberate, each thought clear. I paused by the small cabinet near the living room, the one that held old mail, receipts, and things I had kept out of habit rather than necessity. And I opened it, scanning through the contents with a different kind of attention than before, not sentimental, not attached, but purposeful. I pulled out a stack of envelopes, some unopened, some barely glanced at, and I brought them to the table, sitting down again as I began to sort through them, statements, notices, updates, details I had once trusted others to handle. And as I reviewed them now, I began to see the small ways in which control had quietly shifted over time. Automatic payments set up without my direct involvement, mailing, addresses updated to include Daniel's office, decisions made under the assumption that I would not question them, none of it dramatic, none of it urgent, but all of it intentional in its own quiet way. I made a small pile to my left, documents that needed to be reviewed further, and another to my right, things that would require action, and I worked through them methodically, not rushing, not overwhelmed, simply focused, because this was no longer about catching up, it was about reclaiming. I reached for my laptop and opened it, logging into accounts I had not accessed in years, taking my time with each one, updating passwords, reviewing settings, making small adjustments that added up to something larger, something more complete. And as I did, I felt that same steady clarity guiding me, not driven by anger or urgency, but by a quiet understanding of what needed to be done. The afternoon light shifted gradually across the room, moving from the window to the far wall, marking the passage of time in a way that felt almost deliberate, and I did not rush to keep up with it. I allowed the work to take the time it required. Because this was not something that needed to be finished quickly, it needed to be done correctly. I paused briefly to stretch my hands, then returned to the documents, noting details, making calls where necessary, each interaction calm, direct, efficient. I was no longer explaining myself, no longer asking for permission. I was simply acting, and there was a quiet strength in that, one that did not need to be announced or defended. It simply existed. As the last of the paperwork was set aside, I leaned back in my chair and allowed myself a moment to take in the room. Around me, the familiar walls, the steady light, the sense of order that had returned not just to the space, but to my understanding of it. I thought again of Ashley, of the certainty in her voice, and I realized that certainty had depended on something very specific: my inaction, my silence, my willingness to let things continue as they had been. And now that those conditions no longer existed, neither did her certainty. I stood up and walked toward the front of the house, my steps unhurried. My thoughts settled, because there was one more thing I needed to do, not as a reaction, not as a statement, but as a continuation of everything that had already begun. I reached for my keys, the same small ceramic bowl holding them as it always had, and I picked them up with a steady hand, slipping them into my purse before heading toward the door. The late afternoon air was cooler now as I stepped outside, the light softer, the neighborhood quieter, and as I walked down the front path, I felt that same calm certainty settle more firmly within me. This was not about proving anything to anyone. It was about aligning my actions with what I now understood. I got into my car and started the engine, not with hesitation, but with intention, because the next step did not need to be dramatic to be significant. It only needed to be mine. And as I pulled out of the driveway, I allowed a small, knowing smile to return, because for the first time in a long while, I was no longer reacting to the story being told around me. I was beginning to write my own. I parked 2 blocks away from the office, not because there was no closer space, but because I wanted the walk, the few extra minutes to let everything settle into place before I stepped inside. The building itself was exactly as I remembered: modest, professional, with large glass windows that reflected the late afternoon light in a way that made everything look slightly softer than it was. I turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, not hesitating, just acknowledging the step I was about to take. Because there is a difference between knowing what needs to be done and choosing to do it. And this was the moment where that choice became real. I stepped out of the car and adjusted my coat, smoothing it down with a simple, practiced motion before beginning the short walk, my pace steady, unhurried, each step measured, not out of uncertainty, but out of control. I pushed the glass door open and stepped into the quiet lobby, the familiar scent of polished wood and paper greeting me. And for a brief second, I was aware of how long it had been since I had entered a space like this on my own terms, not accompanying my husband, not deferring decisions, but standing fully in my own place. The receptionist looked up and offered a polite smile. "Good afternoon. How can I help you?" And I returned it with the same calm composure I had carried with me all day, giving my name clearly. Without hesitation, she nodded and asked me to take a seat, and I did, choosing a chair near the window, where the light fell evenly across the room. I placed my purse beside me and folded my hands in my lap, my posture straight, my breathing even, as I waited, not impatiently, not anxiously, simply present. The minutes passed quietly, the faint sound of a printer in the background, the soft murmur of voices from an office down the hall, and I allowed myself to observe it all without distraction. Because this was not a place of emotion, it was a place of clarity, of decisions that carried weight without needing volume. When my name was called, I stood immediately, smoothing my coat once more before following him down the hallway. His greeting was professional but warm, the kind that acknowledged history without assuming anything about the present. We entered his office, and I took the seat across from his desk, placing the folder carefully in front of me, not sliding it forward yet, just resting my hand on it as I met his eyes. "I have reviewed everything," I said, my voice steady, measured, and I noticed the slight shift in his expression, not surprise, but attention, the kind that comes when someone recognizes that a conversation is about to move beyond routine. He nodded, inviting me to continue, and I opened the folder, turning it toward him just enough to indicate what I was referring to. "I would like to make some changes," I continued, not hurried, not tentative, simply clear. There was no need to explain why. No need to justify the decision, because this was not about reaction, it was about intention. He listened carefully, asking precise questions, clarifying details, and I answered each one with the same calm certainty, outlining what I wanted, what I did not want, where control would remain, and where it would not be assumed. There were no raised voices, no dramatic pauses, just a quiet, deliberate reshaping of something that had once been left unattended. And as we worked through the specifics, I felt that same steady sense of alignment settle deeper within me, not because I was taking something away, but because I was finally placing it where it had always belonged. When the paperwork was outlined and the next steps confirmed, I closed the folder gently and rested my hand on top of it once more, not as a shield, but as a marker, a quiet acknowledgement that something had shifted. We exchanged a few final words, professional, respectful, and I stood, offering a small nod before turning toward the door, my movements as measured as when I had entered, but lighter now, not in emotion, but in clarity. I walked back through the hallway, past the receptionist, out through the glass doors, and into the evening air, the light lower now, the sky beginning to soften into dusk, and I paused for just a second on the sidewalk, not because I needed to gather myself, but because I wanted to recognize the moment, the difference between the woman who had walked in and the one who was now stepping away. I returned to my car and got in, placing the folder beside me on the passenger seat, visible, present, not hidden, and as I started the engine, I allowed that same quiet, knowing smile to return, because nothing I had done needed to be announced, nothing needed to be explained. The shift had already happened, and they would only begin to understand it when the consequences quietly reached them, not all at once, not with noise, but with the same calm certainty I now carried with me. I did not call them, not that evening, not the next day, and not the day after that, because there was no urgency left in me to explain what I had done or to prepare them for what was coming. And for the first time, I understood that silence could be a form of clarity, not confusion. The house felt different now, not because anything had physically changed, but because I had. I moved through each room with the same steady awareness I had carried with me for days, noticing the small details, without attaching meaning to them. The photographs, the furniture, the quiet echoes of conversations that had once filled the space. They were still there, but they no longer held me in place. They simply existed, and so did I. On the fourth morning, my phone rang. Again, Ashley's name this time, and I looked at it for a moment before answering, not out of reluctance, but out of recognition, because I knew this call would be different from Daniel's, more direct, less uncertain. "Margaret," she said, her tone polished, controlled, the same tone she had used at the table, as if every word had already been measured. I wanted to follow up about the house. I leaned back slightly in my chair, my hand resting lightly on the armrest. "What about it?" I asked, my voice calm, neutral, giving nothing more than the question itself. There was a brief pause, just enough to suggest that she had expected a different response, something more open, more accommodating. "Daniel and I have been discussing some plans," she continued. "We think it would make sense to start preparing for a transition, given everything." I allowed her words to settle, not interrupting, not reacting, because I wanted to hear exactly how far she was willing to go without being corrected. "A transition," I repeated, not questioning, simply acknowledging. "Yes," she said, a slight emphasis now. "It would be easier for everyone if we could start making arrangements sooner rather than later." I could almost see her, standing somewhere in their kitchen, her posture straight, her expression composed, confident in the direction she believed this conversation would take, and for a moment, I let the silence stretch just enough for that confidence to settle in, to become comfortable before I spoke again. "There will be no transition," I said, my voice even, not raised, not sharpened, just clear, and the shift on the other end was immediate, not loud, not dramatic, but unmistakable. "I am not sure I understand," she replied, her tone still controlled, but now edged with something else, something tighter. "Then I will make it simple," I continued, maintaining the same calm cadence. "The house remains exactly where it is, and so do I." There was a longer pause. This time, the kind that signals recalculation, the quiet moment where assumptions begin to falter. "Margaret," she said slowly, "I think you might be misunderstanding the situation." I let out a small breath, not a sigh, not frustration, just a release of something that no longer needed to be held. "No," I said gently. "I think I understand it very clearly now." And I could feel the difference in my own voice, not just in tone, but in weight, because this was no longer a conversation about interpretation. It was a statement of fact. "We were under the impression that things had already been arranged," she continued, and there it was, not hidden, not softened, the assumption spoken out loud, and I allowed myself a small, quiet smile, unseen, but fully present. "You were under an impression," I replied, that is not the same as an arrangement. The silence that followed was no longer comfortable, no longer controlled. It carried a different kind of tension now, one that did not come from me, and I did not rush to fill it, because this was the moment where understanding begins, not through explanation, but through the absence of what was expected. "We will need to revisit this," she said finally. Her voice composed again, but less certain than before. "You are welcome to review anything you would like," I answered. "Everything is exactly as it should be." I paused briefly, then added, "And it will remain that way." There was nothing more for me to say, nothing to negotiate, nothing to defend, and I could sense that she knew it. Even if she was not ready to accept it, the call ended shortly after, not abruptly, not dramatically, just a quiet conclusion to something that had already shifted beyond her control. I set the phone down and remained where I was, my posture unchanged, my expression calm. Because this was not a victory, not in the way people often think of it. It was simply alignment, the quiet restoration of something that had never truly been lost, only overlooked. I stood up and walked toward the window, the morning light stretching across the street, steady, consistent, unchanged, and I realized that nothing I had done required acknowledgement to be real. Nothing needed to be seen to exist. They would come to understand it in their own time, through the absence of what they expected, through the quiet resistance of what would not move. And as I stood there, looking out at the same street I had seen every day for years, I felt that same calm certainty settle once more, not because I had taken something back, but because I had finally stopped giving it away.